Alright, let's begin. This is lecture on the Constitutional Convention. This is essentially Unit 2. We've talked about the philosophical foundations, and now let's take a look at the Constitution itself. If you're following along in terms of your notes and you want to take a look at the outline that I've given, it is online on the website right above the video. So you can print that out, follow along if you need to. Also in our book, most of this is coming from Chapter 2 of the main textbook, and then Unit 2 of the We the People textbook. I'll reference it where appropriate, but you may want to be paying attention to that information as well. Alright, so let me switch over to the PowerPoint and follow along in your outline and take notes as we go along. The key question we really start out looking at is what happened in the summer of 1787. We've already talked about how Shay's rebellion really set the tone for the colonists, the new country, the new citizens of this country, and what that government was going to look like. The Articles of Confederation had failed the country in terms of organizing them and securing them, and the danger that Shay's rebellion presented was a wake-up call to the country. And so they gathered first in Annapolis, and only 5 of the 13 states had delegates show up. And they decided we needed to meet again. And so in May of 1787, they meet in Philadelphia, in what would be known then as the Constitutional Convention. We have to remember again that since the Articles of Confederation were not holding this young country together, they needed something that was much stronger, that was going to hold the country together. And so they decided in Annapolis, and certainly then in Philadelphia, that this was going to be, it was requiring them to meet in secret, because they had a fractured and fragile country that, if they weren't careful, was going to become on the verge of a civil war. And the question I ask you is really, was this the best option? Was it the best option for them to meet in secret? Did it make sense? Think about why they were doing it. What would the challenge have been if this was a public meeting, or even if it wasn't public, if the public just knew that they were meeting and they decided that the government wasn't functioning and they needed to change it? Hopefully you can understand or begin to look at that question of why did they choose to do it? What was the necessity of keeping it secret? We'll talk in class about Benjamin Franklin and what the fear was with Benjamin Franklin. But all in all, the convention was kept secret, and they were able to do some major reworking, certainly a complete overhaul of the American government system. One of the people who wasn't there, but of course a major founder of our country, the writer of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson. And Thomas Jefferson was off in France, helping to start and help organize, in some senses, or observe the impending French Revolution, which America and our revolution had inspired. Thomas Jefferson called the gathering of those 55 men at Independence Hall in Philadelphia an assembly of demigods. Now, that's not a negative term. In fact, it's a very positive term. It's a very flattering term. A demigod is something just below a god, a partial god, someone that is almost a god. And these 55 men were of vastly different experience. The average age of someone at the convention was 42. They were learned, they were scholars, they were political representatives and governors of the states, signers of the Declaration of Independence, people that would go on to become presidents and vice presidents. And in many ways, Thomas Jefferson was right. But of course, they all did have something in common in terms of this. And I'm going to try and get my note here. They were all white. property-owning men. It's not surprising that, of course, these were the people that were there. They were the ones in political control, and of course they're the ones that end up with the right to vote in the beginning of our country. It will evolve as we go, but nonetheless, Thomas Jefferson was one of them, and he looked at his colleagues as almost gods. 100 years after the Constitutional Convention was convened and the Constitution was created, William Gladstone, a statesman from England, said the work of the convention was the most wonderful work ever struck off at a given time by the brain and purpose of man. It's no wonder that this Constitution has lived for well over 200 years and has been copied, and the structure has been repeated in countless countries around the world. They were the products of the Age of Enlightenment, and this idea of the Constitution worked. And 100 years later, William Gladstone saw the need and the beauty of what was created. I want to talk particularly about two men that were there. First is George Washington. George Washington, of course, is the epitome of what it means to be a virtuous citizen in American history. We see him as such. Washington is seen as this great leader, this great civic servant. He didn't want to be considered the leader, but he was thrust into that leadership position by his peers. George Washington, because of all his work in the Revolutionary War, because of his work to try and keep the country together, is known as the father of our country. That, of course, is why they name Washington, D.C. after him, Washington being named after him, and D.C., the District of Columbia, named after Christopher Columbus, two key figures in the early history of America. And George Washington didn't want to serve in this leadership post. He didn't want to be the leader of the Continental Army. He was the best, though. He didn't want to be elected the chair of the Constitutional Convention in 1787, but unanimously they elected him. He didn't want to run for president and be elected president, but he was the logical choice. He was the one that everybody looked to for leadership throughout this whole process. Another founding father, is James Madison. James Madison has a couple of interesting pieces that we need to know. First off, in terms of the idea of father, he's considered the father of the Constitution. And as the father of the Constitution, he was the one who came to the convention with a draft. He was the gunner. He was the go-getter. He was the one that had the draft in his back pocket, knowing that the Articles of Confederation were going to be thrown out. And when they didn't know what to do after they threw out the Articles of Confederation, he's the one that laid his draft on the table. And that draft, in a sense, in many senses, was the Constitution almost in whole. The other thing that we can credit James Madison for is the role he played as scribe. Had James Madison not been the scribe of the convention, we would not have known exactly what the debates were and what everybody said. In a sense, he was the court reporter at the convention. Instead of typing out all of the words as you would in a courthouse or in a courtroom in a case, he was handwriting everything that everyone said, and meticulous notes give us a great insight as to the debates that were happening at the Constitutional Convention. When they got there, they realized they needed to do something. They needed to be very direct, and they needed to fix the government. And so Edmund Randolph, who was a delegate from Virginia, put forth a resolution on May 30th, right at the beginning of the convention. And it said that the national government ought to be established consisting of a supreme legislative, executive, and judiciary. Essentially what he was saying is if we take the Articles of Confederation and we look at them, they don't work. We need to throw them out completely. We need to tear them up. We need to throw them out. This is exactly the opposite of what they were there to do. They were called to come together to amend the Articles of Confederation. But then once Edmund Randolph proposed this idea, it was a contentious decision, but they ended up making the decision to throw out the Articles and create a brand new government that was a strong national government with the supreme legislative, executive, and judiciary. Supreme meaning supreme over the states and supreme over the people. This was revolutionary. This was totally different than anything they'd ever seen before. And so they had to come up with a plan. Well, since Virginia was one of the most powerful, certainly one of the largest, they put together a plan and they proposed it on the floor of the convention for those 55 men to debate. It had a number of different parts. Number one, it created a strong national government. And this is very simple. This is in response to the Articles of Confederation, which had a weak national government, essentially a national government with little powers. They created a federal system of power. In this sense, it was the idea that these governments were going to share power. The state government was going to share powers with the national government. This wasn't a confederation like we looked at in Unit 1, which the states gave a little bit of power to the national government to make it somewhat small and functional. No, in a sense, the government of the nation would be powerful, and the government of the states would also be powerful. They said it would have 3 branches. Again, this was different than the Articles of Confederation. The legislative, executive, and judicial were the key parts, with the legislative being the most powerful. They wanted the voice of the people that had elected the representatives to have the most power, which I think makes logical sense. Because keep in mind, they were not proposing the executive would be voted on by the people, and nor would the courts be voted on by the people. They proposed that there be 2 houses of Congress, a bicameral legislature, the House of Representatives, and then the Senate. Specifically, the House of Representatives would be elected by the people. Whereas the Senate would be essentially elected by the House. So the only place where the original plan had the voice of the people included was in the House of Representatives. When we look at that idea, it's challenging to a number of states, because what they were saying is each state will be represented proportionally. The larger the population you have, the more representatives you have in Congress, or the more money you pay into the national treasury, the more seats you get in Congress. The question I have for you is, who likes that? Who likes the idea that the bigger state that you are, the more representation you get? They also had an interesting proposal that the executive branch would be one person. That's not interesting, we have that today. But that one person would serve a single 7-year term. And they would not be allowed to run for office again. They would not be allowed to run for re-election. They serve a single 7-year term. Think about that. What challenges does that bring, or what benefits does that bring, given our current system? The Virginia plan was, of course, was not well received by everybody, and so the counter plan offered by the smaller states was the New Jersey plan. And it created a number of things that we've seen already. First of all, it maintained the structure as outlined in the Articles of Confederation. Strong state governments, weak national governments. They said there's only going to be one house in the National Congress, almost exactly like what they had in the Articles of Confederation. They did recognize that the national government didn't have enough power, and so what they said was, we'll give specific and limited powers to the national government. If we don't limit them, it will get out of control. But they do realize that they have to give this power to tax. One thing that didn't work in the Articles of Confederation was that the national government, didn't have power to tax. They couldn't pay the debts off. They couldn't pay the war debt from the Revolutionary War. So they realized they needed to amend that. In the New Jersey plan, they said there will be equal representation in each house. One state, one vote. And consider again, who likes that plan? Why would these states be in favor of equal representation in the House? Why would the other states be opposed to it? And rather than one person being the executive branch, because they were fearful of that power, they said the executive branch would simply be a committee of people that would serve the government and enforce the laws. Not one person, but a committee of people that would work together to enforce the laws that Congress, the most powerful group, had passed. As we look at these issues very specifically tomorrow, I want you to think about a couple of things. Number one, first of all, jot down any questions you have right now in terms of what we just talked about. Why they chose this for the New Jersey plan. Why they chose this for Virginia plan. Why might the small states like one? Why might the large states like the other? Anything you didn't get or need to review, I want you to push the pause button right now and then jot those questions down so we can cover them tomorrow. The other thing that I want you to consider is, was it a good idea to hold this convention in secret? Why did they choose that? What would that look like today if our government operated in secret? Are there times when that is necessary? Think about that plan in the Virginia plan, the idea offered that the president would serve a single 7-year term. Is that a good idea? Think about why that is a good idea or why not. And then think about what the folks in the New Jersey plan said. Is it a good idea for the executive branch to be a committee instead of just one person? Are there challenges by having one person be president? Are there benefits to having the executive branch be a committee of people? I want you to think about that for tomorrow, and we'll take a look at these topics specifically. If you want to get ahead a little bit, the next lecture is on the compromises that come out of the convention. These two groups, the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan, are quite divisive, and they divide the loyalties of those at the convention. That's the subject of the next lecture, but take a look at these questions and we'll talk about them tomorrow.